Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and I'm back with something that's going to be a little bit of a different video on cards than I normally do. Instead of a deck tech today, I'm going to be starting a series that is going to essentially give a new player the foundation they need to better analyze decks and just overall generally improve how they build and play decks. This is going to be a multi-part series that will be coming over the next couple weeks. But for part one, we're largely going to analyze just one basic thing, and that is describing what a deck does. Essentially, it's archetype. How does a deck win? What is it planning to do? And how to start building a way around that. With that said, before we get into it, if you enjoy this content, make sure to like and subscribe. I do a lot of content like this, and you'll definitely not want to miss out on the future videos of this series, because that's going to contain a lot of important information also. Regardless, let's take a look at some of the starter lists. Now, one thing that I gotta talk about is that previously I've actually done a series of videos like this. A long time ago, I went over how to build German deck lists in a manner that took you from essentially just starting out up until a meta list. But a problem that came around was that the nation just kind of evolved. The deck kind of fell apart when new content came out and balance changes. So I'm not going to be using specific deck examples for anything more than just giving you kind of an idea of how to analyze decks. There's not going to be specific deck instructions for this. I'm trying to give you better knowledge and understanding of why a deck would be called aggro or control or something similar. So before we look into the decks themselves, what is an archetype? Within a card game, and this is true for most card games, the archetype simply talks about the broad idea of what a deck is trying to do. And this was popularized around Magic the Gathering 20, 30 years ago, but we essentially have 3 or 4 primary archetypes. We have aggro, mid-range, control, and combo. And each of these generally plans to play pretty different from each other. So the first one we're going to take a look at is aggro, and the Blitzkrieg deck is a decent example of this. Aggro is a deck that is looking to win quickly. Aggro is a short term for an aggressive deck, and that's exactly what this deck does. Within cards, this mostly is going to be represented by a lot of cheap cards. As you can see with this starter deck, you have a lot of 1, 2, and 3 credit cards, and pretty much nothing after that. It's very much focused around the early game and doesn't have a lot to go later into a match. As such, it is looking to win quickly and aggressive, and it looks to win quickly by killing the enemy as fast as possible. In cards, you see this through things like Blitz, on top of sometimes ways to boost damage, such as a card like Blitzkrieg. However, this is not the only way to build aggro. With all these archetypes, there are a lot of ways to build a specific archetype. Aggro, for example, can be something like this, where it's focused around kind of blitz tanks and controlling the front line. But there are some aggro decks that are, say, based around artillery pieces or bombers or something like infantry with destruction effects, and those destruction effects deal damage to the HQ, the so-called burn decks. And we're not going to get too deep into that because it'll change over time, and that's not the goal. But the main thing to remember is that aggro means winning quickly. Then we move on to control. So control is kind of the polar opposite of aggro. Instead of looking to win quickly, it is looking to drag the game out and win through attrition. That is generally the way control wins, although control can also have big game-ending threats. But it generally wins by surviving the early game and having more power late game. In cards, this translates to stuff like units with guard, removal orders, alongside healing and various other effects. And then at the top end, usually there are some larger cards that are able to better close a game out. In general, control is a little bit more expensive to build, but does offer some decent power. But when you're looking at a control or looking at a deck, control generally can be seen through it running guards, a lot of removal, and healing. Those are the three things you can generally look for in a control deck to tell if it's a control deck. And generally those are the three things you want. Card draw is also important, but granted, almost every deck usually wants a little bit of card draw. But mainly those first three things are the important ones to find and usually look for when you're looking for a control deck. Then we have mid-range. Mid-range is the in-between of the decks. And unlike aggro, which is trying to win very quickly outright, or control that is looking to take the game long, mid-range is sitting in between, hence it being called mid-range. As you can see, this Japanese US list potentially offers a decent example of a mid-range list. We have a lot of cheap blitz units, and it looks very much like an aggro deck. However, we also have some bigger cards. We have some big chunky units, some late game plays. So it's a bit of a different beast. And the best way to describe it is that mid-range is looking to be an aggro deck when it faces against control, and then it acts like a control deck when it's facing off against an aggro deck. So essentially, it kind of changes its role based on who it's facing. This generally means that these decks have some late game power, not as much as control, but they're able to go past, maybe the first 5 or 6 turns and can still win even if they haven't if they don't have the enemy on death's door. But this is definitely maybe a bit harder to discern. Mid-range is one of those decks that can take very different forms based on it. There are some mid-range decks that look a lot like or an aggro deck, but they're actually mid-range. It's a blurry line, so they're a bit of a hazy thing, but generally I would say the best thing to look for is if this deck has a notable amount of 4 and 5 credit cards. Usually aggro decks will commit heavily to having a dominating amount of 1, 2, and 3 credit cards, with just a minor sprinkle of 4 or 5 credit cards. Mid-range often is running a decent amount of 4 and 5 drops on top of that, and it might even go a bit higher depending on the list. And then the final thing, which we don't actually have a deck here, but that is a combo deck. Combo decks are a bit of an interesting beast, because they are like control decks, but they're kind of taken to an extreme. Instead of looking to win through an attrition-based strategy, combo decks focus on usually building around a specific combination to winning the game. A good example of this could be something like Burning Sun. Although Burning Sun, at least at the time of recording, is not good, this could be a combo card. Playing down a bunch of cheap blitz planes and then using Burning Sky to give them all +3 attack could allow you to win the game in one turn. That is what combo decks do. They're called one-turn kills, or OTKs. And they're largely focused around that. And in order to achieve that, instead of loading up with guards and removal, which they still do have, they also are more interested in cards that can delay the opponent. So for example, in cards, this generally means that they're looking for things like pins, something like naval operation that could pin an entire board, or something such as Scorched Earth. which is able to slow the enemy board down significantly. These are powerful effects that aren't killing enemy units, but instead giving the combo deck time and stalling in order to draw more cards, because combo decks are best discerned by often a very high density of card draw, because they're looking to find their combo as quickly as possible and then use that combo to instantly win the game. With that all said, those are the 4 main archetypes. Now, as I've been repeating, there's a lot of different examples of them. For example, this Death is a Duty deck that you get at level 12 is an okay example of maybe what could be described as a mid-range deck. However, we could also look at something like the US Polish Steady Does It, which I would say is also pretty much a mid-range deck. It's got a good amount of 4 drops, and its curve is generally much more into the mid-game. Yet, how they win is going to be a good deal different, because they just have different plans. So I can't give you concrete ways to discern a deck, but the main things are understanding the different signs about what a deck looks like. So now, let's do just a little bit of a test. So I'm going to scroll through this deck, and I want you to look at the cards, and once we get through it, I want you to, on your own, guess what archetype this deck is. And then I'll tell you, and hopefully you're able to discern whether you're right or wrong, and I'll explain why I would call the deck a certain thing. So let's start. Alrighty, so this is your last chance to guess what type of deck this would be, but I would personally say that this deck is a mid-range list. Although we have a very high amount of 1 and 3 credit cards, we also have a fair amount of later game tools. Most notably, a good amount of 5, 6, and even a 7 cost card means that although we are able to often play out a ton of very cheap units and play aggressive, we also have some late game punch to us, including some cards like Carpet Bombing that are largely for control aspects. This deck is mid-range, I think. It's not heavy enough to be control, and it's not cheap enough to be aggro. If it were to be aggro, which you could build it that way, I would definitely look to, say, remove these cards, the 5, 6, and 7s. Maybe you could keep a few 5 drops, but I would definitely maybe trim it down a little bit, especially with some of the slower ones, like, say, these just big fighters, which are very slow. And then I'd look to find like more 2 drops and more 4 drops. If I wanted to go control, I'd probably trim down some of these early games and look for guards, healing, and card draw in order to make sure I could last till the late game. And I specifically picked this deck because I mentioned Burning Sun before. And Burning Sun in this deck does not make this deck a combo deck. If you thought it was a combo deck, you got a little bit of a trick. But it's important to recognize that just because a card might be used in a combo deck does not make it like purposely a combo card. There can be decks that just use this for like additional damage, and they're not looking to play everything from hand and then kill you through that. They're instead looking to just use this for extra damage. So don't get tricked by that. Look at the larger overall effect, such as the curve, and also just generally what a majority of the cards are leaning towards. Now let's do this one or two more times just to hopefully give you a little bit more chance to test and see if you got a good understanding of this. Alrighty, so I would say that this deck is very much an aggro deck. As we can see, we have a fair amount of 1, 2, and 3 drops. The majority of our deck is made up of these cheap cards. We have a lot of those options, and even for the cards that go to 4 or 5 credits, most of them are focused around pretty much finishing the game out. If you look, a lot of these cards are dealing damage to the enemy HQ, or have blitz on them, and that serves as a finisher for our deck. The main focus of our deck is more so around attacking with cheap blitz units and a variety of effects like that. Very much an aggressive deck that is looking to win the game quickly, because it does not last if the game drags on for very long. And then the final one that we're going to just test with this is the US one. So overall, I would say that this is actually a control deck. Now, this is a special type of control deck in what is called ramp, which is largely specific to the US, but it's still very much a control deck. You can see that we have some guards. We also have a lot of removal, such as Awoken Giant and Gunship Mission. We have card draw, and then we have board clears, more removal, and a fair amount of late game cards. Now, granted, this is the starter deck, so it's not the most well put together, but that's actually why I chose these. So you're able to kind of, as a new player, look at maybe a deck you took with your limited collection and can better understand, what is this deck trying to do. But we're very clearly kind of looking to take the game a bit longer. We have some large bombers, board clears, card draw, a variety of different tools that kind of build us to, take it long and maybe try to outlast the enemy. Room for improvement, certainly, but I would say that is definitely the case. Now, some stuff like the M8 Greyhound and other cheap units like the 506 and our large amount of 3 drops, like Marines and the 30th Regiment, might have tricked you into thinking this is a mid-range deck. And it is true that this deck does lean a little bit into a mid-range package, but I would say that overall it is definitely leaning closer to control due to the larger amount of heavy units alongside things like the credit gaining. So, as you can see, and it's important to remember that even if you didn't guess these right, or if you did, it's important to remember that decks do kind of blur the line no matter what. There's never a deck that is like purely aggro, because there are times where even the most aggressive of decks might have to play like a control deck for a turn, where they deal with a threat or something similar. So it's a very different, it's always going to be a bit ambiguous, but being able to more so recognize what a deck does is going to give us a good foundation of how we further build a deck. And with that example, whenever you go to build a new deck, you now just need to ask yourself, obviously you got to pick what nation you want to do. However, you can then take that nation and ask you, what archetype am I looking to build? And use that to pick an ally that is going to effectively help you. Now, I again can't predict the future, so I won't know maybe what nation would be best for whatever deck you're trying to build. However, as an example, with a US deck, maybe I want to build a control deck. Alright, so whether I go online and look it up, or maybe I just look at my cards, a nation like Britain has a lot of guards in it, and healing, and card draw, and those are the foundations for a control deck, so they would make a good ally. And then we can go on and build whatever deck we wanted to. But the biggest thing is that we recognized that, okay, I want to play a control deck, so I'm going to need cheap guards, I'm going to need healing, I will need stuff like card draw, and then after that, I also need some removal, like say from orders. So we possibly can do those. And then I also need some late game power, so maybe we add in some larger and more powerful late game options. And obviously that's not a complete deck, but hopefully you get the idea that you're able to understand what a specific deck is doing and can then make better decisions for that. As an example, I would not look to run something such as like this 10th Engineer Battalion. This card is not really meant for control decks. It's about boosting adjacent ground units, which is quite good with like artillery pieces and whatnot, but it's not going to feed into the plan of control that much. It's just not going to be that effective. Instead, we would want a card like, say, the Jasko, which is a defensive tool. Or we could look for something like, say, the Engineer Regiment, which heals us and also even gives us an extra credit slot, which is quite nice. And hopefully this shows you that on how to maybe analyze a deck a bit better. It's important to remember that not every deck combination can be made to work. Like at the current example, I would not look to take something like Japan and combine it with, say, Germany and make a control deck out of that. Now, granted, this will change over time, but it's just important to recognize that not every nation combination is able to build every type of deck. Some nations are better at some things than others, and we'll talk about that more in future parts, but the main thing that I want you to take away from this video are the main 4 archetypes of aggro, control, mid-range, and combo. The main aspects that are available for all 4 of them: aggro wins quickly and wants cheap cards. Mid-range or control looks to mostly use removal in the early game and guards, and looks to slow the game down and then heal and draw cards and close the game out with big threats themselves. Mid-range is an in-between, looking to have cheap aggressive cards but also some more power into the late game with some more expensive cards. And then combo is looking to play like control but stall the game out and draw a bunch of cards until they eventually find whatever combo allows them to win in one turn. But that is going to be it for part 1 of this video. Again, if you like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and even leave a comment down below. Tell me if you found this useful, as I'm hopefully going to make this into a series, and you'll all be able to have a good way to learn about some important aspects of how to build decks and play cards. But otherwise, that is it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and have a good day.